80% of the advice on TikTok is bad advice. The big misconception is people confuse mental strength with just acting tough.
Amy Morin has spent over 2 decades helping people unlock the power of resilience. As a licensed clinical social worker and international best-selling author of 13 Things Mentally Strong People Don't Do.
After I became a therapist, my mom passed away suddenly. She and I had been super close. This is probably one of my biggest fears in life. I don't even have enough money to pay the bills. And I thought, how do you get through this? A tough time. And when you want to do something better in life, when you want to improve your mental health, you should do something. And that was when I wrote a list of what mentally strong people don't do. And I put it on the internet. 15 million people read it, got to become an author who writes books because it resonated with so many people. Sometimes it's not about what you do, it's more about what you don't do.
Amy has sold over 1 million copies across her transformative series, empowering parents, women, and professionals to build mental strength.
When our emotions goes up, our logic goes down. So the more intense we feel an emotion, the more difficult it is to think clearly. Don't make the same mistakes over and over again. Don't give up after your first failure. Enjoy the ride and don't worry too much about what's going to happen in the future.
She's inspired audiences at global giants like Google, YouTube, and Under Armour, and has been featured in Time, Oprah.com, and Men's Health, with appearances on Good Morning America and CNBC. A speaker, author, and thought leader, Amy is redefining how we understand and cultivate mental toughness for a stronger, more resilient life.
Welcome to Success Story. I'm your host, Scott Clary. The Success Story podcast is part of the HubSpot podcast network. HubSpot not only supports this show, but they support entrepreneurs. That's why I'm such a huge fan of HubSpot. And I'm very grateful for HubSpot for supporting the show because they help entrepreneurs. And as a fellow entrepreneur, I know it takes a lot to grow your business, a lot of audience attracting, a lot of sales, a lot of marketing, a lot of lead scoring, a lot of channel management, a lot of content, a lot of long days, late nights, a lot of weekends, a lot of wishing there was an easier way, but there is. With Breeze, this is HubSpot's new collection of AI tools. It's easier than ever for marketers, for entrepreneurs to attract audiences, to increase leads, to score customers, and to close deals fast, which means pretty soon your company will have a lot to celebrate. Visit HubSpot.com/marketers to learn more. Why do people have such a hard time developing mental toughness and mental calluses, and why is it so difficult to be mentally strong? What are the things outside of the obvious that just wear us down every single day that we have such a hard time dealing with?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, nobody ever teaches us how to be mentally strong, right? Like, it was nothing I learned in school. And even when I was going to be a therapist, they talked a lot about building on your strengths and finding out what's working well in life. But like, literally nobody tells you, how do you get through tough times? How do you grieve? How do you deal with a loss in your life or when you reach an obstacle? And there's a lot of books out there that are written by people who are really good at marketing, but they're not necessarily good advice. And we see the same with TikTok. And research will show like 80% of the advice on TikTok that has to do with mental health is bad advice. In fact, a lot of it is downright destructive and harmful. So then you think, well, where do we get our information? Well, when I was a kid, my teachers didn't talk about feelings. My parents certainly didn't talk about emotions or how do you deal with sadness or anxiety. It was more like quit crying or don't worry about it. Well, it's not helpful when you're struggling with something for somebody to say, don't worry. It doesn't make you not worry. It just makes you feel like there's something wrong with me. So because of that, we grow up really not knowing a lot of these basic things because nobody taught us. And then we didn't have an opportunity to practice. How do you deal with these challenges in life and what do you do about them? So a lot of the solutions that we turn to are things that work really well in the moment, whether it's eating too much because I'm lonely, or reaching for a drink because I think I need to relax, or staying up really late at night because I feel like that will help me stay more productive. And all of these things work in the moment, but then they backfire. And we have trouble connecting those dots or thinking, well, what do I do instead? Or if I'm really uncomfortable right now and I could reach for this thing that helps me in the moment and I'm not going to do that, then how am I going to tolerate this uncomfortable feeling? Or how am I going to push through? Or when something feels scary, like, does that mean I shouldn't do it? Well, no. Sometimes that just means it feels scary and you should do it anyway. But because nobody talks about it and nobody teaches us these things, it's really difficult to build mental strength until you have a recipe of how do you do it, what does it take, and what steps do you do to get there. And I think another big misconception is people confuse mental strength with just acting tough. And they'll think, well, if I didn't cry for 3 months, it means I was strong. Or if I push through at all costs, then clearly I'm a strong person. And people don't want to quit. I see so many social media memes about like, never give up. If you have a failing business and you're about to go completely broke, by all means, stop and do something differently. But I see so many people who want to push through because they think in doing something different, pivoting, giving up would be just a sign that I'm not mentally strong enough to handle it. But there's so many things in life that we should be walking away from and learning from.
Man, that's such a good answer, but it's still when somebody's listening to that answer, it's still like, oh my God. So now I have to figure out when I should walk away, when I stay, which things are benefiting me, which things are hurting me, which instincts do I listen to, which ones do I not listen to. We're gonna get into all of it, obviously, but I think that it's actually really important to understand even your own journey, because I like learning from people that sort of wrote the playbook. So you, like everyone else who's listening, did not have this playbook growing up. What was your first, I guess, inflection point in your life that it wasn't just a trying experience, but it was something that's prompted you to say, I want to figure out how to get through this shit, but then also I need to figure out how to get through the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, because the thing and the reaction that I'm having to this particular thing, I'm assuming that's sort of how this concept evolved, it's not serving me. So walk me through sort of your interest in this field is the best way to put it.
Well, I grew up an incredibly anxious kid. I threw up before school every day for years. I hated school. And people would ask me, like, what do you hate about it? I didn't even have the words. I just said, it's a really long day. And to this day, I don't even know what exactly I hated about it. Like, I had good grades, I had friends. I just didn't want to be there. And it just felt like it was 4 years, like one school day. And so I vomited before school. And it took a long time for even my parents to figure this out. But about 9 o'clock in the morning, suddenly I felt much better. And I didn't know what it was either for a long time. But like 9 a.m., I'm like running around having a good time. And they were like, the bus just went by. And once you knew you didn't have to go to school, suddenly you feel better. And so I knew that as an adult, like I never wanted to do anything that made me feel so bad that I would have a physical response like that. So I was kind of always interested in mental strength. Now, we never got therapy for it. We never, like, this was not something. I grew up in rural Maine where nobody talked to. I didn't even know anybody who went to therapy. So it really wasn't anything my parents ever considered. They were just like, I don't know, you're going to have to figure this out in life. But I really wanted to know, like, why does that happen? And so I originally thought I was going to be a doctor, realized really early on in college that was not for me. Switched gears and went into social work, became a clinical social worker. My sister, strangely, is a therapist as well. And for a long time, we had these adjoining offices in rural Maine. It was like she and I were the only two therapists for like 100-mile radius. So if you were going to see a therapist, you had to see one of us, basically. But about a year or so after I became a therapist, my mom passed away suddenly. She had a brain aneurysm. And she and I had been super close. And losing her, I realized, okay, like this is probably one of my biggest fears in life. And now I'm facing it head on. And how do you get through that? And I felt like even as a therapist, I was incredibly unprepared to go through grief and to deal with that. And that really is what started me on my journey of, okay, well, how do you build mental strength when you're going through tough times? And what does that mean to be strong when your heart's broken, when you're really struggling? And it was 3 years to the day that my mom died. My 26-year-old husband died of a heart attack, which I didn't even know you could have a heart attack at 26. And talk about my biggest fear after losing my mom. My biggest fear in life certainly was then like, my gosh, what if I lost somebody else? And of course, my husband, that would have been my biggest fear ever. But in the back of my head, I'd think, well, that doesn't happen, right? Like you're not going to lose somebody else. And then it just felt like just beyond even words to describe how it was. It happened on the 3-year anniversary of the day I lost my mom. We were having this discussion like, oh, an anniversary is tough. What are we going to do on this day? And it was that evening that he died of a heart attack. So I don't have my mom. I don't have my husband. I'm supposed to be a therapist who helps other people deal with their problems. I don't even have enough money to pay the bills. Therapists don't make a lot of money. And we had a house by that point and a mortgage to pay. And I thought, oh, how do you get through this? Talk about, a tough time. And a lot of what I had learned by that point was, okay, in school, they had taught me when you want to do something better in life, when you want to improve your mental health, you should do something, like add something good to your list of things you're already doing. But it was during this really rough time in my life that I was like, the last thing I want is like another thing on my to-do list. Like, oh, practice gratitude for 3 hours a day, Amy, and you'll feel better. Didn't work like that. I thought, I need to get rid of something. Like, as long as I don't do certain things, I'll be okay. And a few years after my husband had passed away, I had started writing because I wanted to keep my house. I didn't want to be homeless, basically, and I didn't want to move. But I had started creating content online just as a way to earn a little bit of extra money so that I could keep my house. And but at first, it was very generic articles about random things, nothing to do with therapy or anything like that. But a few years after that, like, worked on my grief, really had to do a lot of soul searching, digging, figuring out, like, don't have these certain bad habits and you'll be okay. Fortunate enough, I found love again. I got remarried, got a new house, a new job. Life was looking pretty good. But around that same time, my father-in-law was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And I was just like, I just spent like all these years grieving. I'm about to lose somebody else. Like, life had just finally felt good. How am I going to deal with one more loss? And I wrote myself a letter of what not to do, because that was the only thing that felt like it was doable in that moment, was just, Amy, don't do these things and you'll be okay. And that was when I wrote a list of what mentally strong people don't do. And I put it on the internet hoping somebody would read it. But 50 million people read it. And that's how I got to become an author who writes books, because it resonated with so many people of sometimes it's not about what you do, it's more about what you don't do.
And this first list, this list that, like, again, like, went viral. Obviously, it's when things like that just hit home, that everybody's dealing with it, but nobody knows how to put it into words. And you incorporate into this list things from your own lived experiences, probably, but also from your professional background. You understood how these things impact you. So let's actually just start off with that. Let's start off with, like, the first version of, or the list really, that I think helps people get through these really tough times based on all the different things that you went through. And then we can talk about maybe why these things work so well. And we can talk about the psychological, maybe even biological pieces to it, because there's a lot there that encompasses, like, mental toughness and making yourself not impervious to these horrible situations that everybody's going to go through, but at least better equipped to deal with them.
Sure. Want me to run through the list?
So let's go through let's go through the list. Just kick it off. It's a good framework just to start, and then we can take it from there.
Let's see how good my memory is if we can do these in order. So
I think I have it written down somewhere too.
Don't feel sorry for yourself. Don't give away your power. Don't make the same mistakes over and over again. Don't give up after your first failure. Don't fear alone time. Don't shy away from change. Don't resent other people's success. Don't worry about pleasing everybody. Don't feel like the world owes you anything.
Let's talk about these rules, or these laws of things that mentally strong people don't do. So can you, from, like, a therapist perspective, talk about why these things are so and you don't have to go through each one, but talk about what these things actually do to the person when they're going through a tough time. Why does, for example, not doing some of these things allow you to go through a death or this very traumatic experience?
So it really boils down to taking responsibility for the way that you think, the way you feel, and the way you behave. So the reason the list starts off with don't feel sorry for yourself is because that's right where I was. I was thinking, this isn't fair. I got another loss in my life. Why me? But I knew as a therapist, like, anybody who comes in feeling sorry for themselves isn't going to get any better. And if you see somebody who feels sorry for themselves and you offer a solution, an idea, any kind of support, their immediate response is, well, that won't work for me, and here's why. Like, my case is special. Like, yes, that strategy works for 99.9% of the people in the world, but I'm the 0.1% that is never going to work for. And they kind of get angry that anybody's even trying to help them out. So I knew that it's okay to be sad and that we have to be sad and that's part of our grieving process. And that's how you heal is by going through those tough things. But I also knew that if I dug in my heels and exaggerated that my life was worse than everybody else's or that this was so horrible I could never recover, I would make those things true. That I could say, yes, my life is awful and I'm going to spend the rest of it sitting on my couch and never leaving again. But that wouldn't do me or anybody else any good. So, and a lot of the things on that list are really about that. Like if you looked at don't give away your power, that's really about saying, well, I'm in charge of how I think, feel, and behave. You can call me an idiot, but I don't have to feel bad. Like that would be my choice if I said like, oh, I feel really bad because Scott called me names today. No, I can just be like, all right, that's his opinion and I can move on. Or if you have a coworker who talks to you a lot, you could be like, that person wastes my time and they ruin my day because they won't stop talking and I can't get anything done. Or you could set a boundary and say, hey, we're not going to do that right now. Or thanks for having a chat with me, but I can't talk. I'm busy. I have something to do. And all of these things are tough sometimes to be like, oh, it really is me who's in charge. But at the same time, like there's a lot of freedom in that, knowing I get to pick what kind of life I have. I can't control all the things that happen to me, but there are so many choices I have. And even when we look at things you can't control somebody else's behavior. You can't control the economy. You can't control whether people buy your products, but you can control how great of a product you make, or you can control how you respond to people when they behave a certain way. So just keeping that in mind, I think, brings us into a lot of freedom where we can say, all right, the choice is up to me. Like, just like you can't always control the hand you were dealt in life. There's so many options in how you respond to it. So this list is really about that, because people who would come into my therapy office, some of them had been handed incredibly difficult cards in life. And yet the ones who were still optimistic, the ones who would say, this has been tough, yet I have these skills and resources and here's how I'm going to get through it, could get through it. And they still were like hopeful about the future compared to other people who were like, can you believe how bad my life is? And they wanted to come in next week and tell me how horrible everything happened in the past 7 days. Like, can you believe how awful this has been too? And these are the people that don't get better. And it seemed so obvious from the outside, like, yeah, it just takes sometimes a little bit of hope, a little bit of optimism, a willingness to try new things, and an openness to say, I'm going to experiment. And if I fail or make a mistake, I can handle that and I'll be okay.
I love that. It's about ownership. And to be like, I need to ask, because it's easy to say, and like you mentioned, much harder to do and to live. So yes, extreme ownership. Yes, believing that you happen to the world doesn't happen to you, and you can take control of your circumstances. It's a very important mindset shift. But in the moment, whether or not it is, God forbid, somebody passes away, or on a much lighter scale, your business isn't working out, or your spouse cheats on you. In the moment, for some people, it is almost impossible to remove themselves, because I think just like anger and anxiety just like take over and you feel helpless. So maybe talk about your strategy, or even like some of the strategies that you've helped your clients with as a therapist. How do you remove yourself from the moment so you can think clearly, so you can take yourself back to this list? Because I think that if somebody's not going through something traumatic, it's very easy to say, oh yeah, that sounds good for next time, until they're going through some shit. And then all of a sudden, like the rules go out the window.
Correct. And that's what happens. And we know from the research, like when our emotions goes up, our logic goes down. So the more intense we feel an emotion, the more difficult it is to think clearly, as you just alluded to. So if somebody gave you a test to take when you're really angry, you would score poorly on it. Like you literally get stupid when you're angry. And anxiety does the same thing to us, or overwhelming sadness. It's nearly impossible to figure out, what do I do next? So we all need tools to deal with uncomfortable feelings. And sometimes they're simple things. Just putting a name to an emotion takes a bunch of the sting out of it. If I could say, hey, I'm really anxious today, my anxiety goes down just a little bit, just because I've helped my brain and my body make sense of it. If I can then say, all right, is this emotion serving me well? We'll call it a friend or an enemy. Like sometimes it's our friend. Like if you feel really sad about something you've lost, by all means embrace it. But if you're sad and you're about to go ask for a raise, in that moment, that's not your friend. You want to boost your mood before you walk into that meeting. So we all need skills and tools to boost our mood. So could be listening to a happy song for a few minutes. It might be a matter of saying, I'm going to go for a walk around the block. I'm going to go outside in nature. I'm going to do something to reduce the intensity of this feeling. Acting the opposite helps. If I feel really sad, my brain's going to say, stay in your pajamas and sit on the couch today. You don't need to go out and do anything. Well, I've never met anybody who said, I skipped work today, sat on the couch in my pajamas, and by noon I felt amazing. And other than when I was 8 and I didn't want to go to school. But for the most part, when we do what our brain tells us to do when we're like stuck in a bad mood, is it just reinforces a bad mood. We listen to angry music when we feel angry, and it makes us feel angrier. So sometimes you have to then say, okay, this emotion isn't serving me well, so I'm going to do the opposite. And I'll sometimes work with people to create what we call a list of mood boosters. So I'll say, what do you do when you're really happy? If you came home from work and you were in an amazing mood, what would you likely do? And somebody might give me a playlist of the songs they listen to. They might say, I would call a friend, I'd go for a walk, I might work in my garden for a while. And we'll take that list of whatever things they say and you hang it on the refrigerator. When you come home from work and you're in a bad mood, I want you to do something on that list. You're not going to feel like doing it, but it makes you feel a little bit better. And we have control over our emotions. So many people say, well, you shouldn't control how you feel. No, by all means, you should. And it's okay to feel sad and it's okay to feel anxious when those emotions are serving you well, but you don't have to stay stuck in them. We have some control over our behavior, and we can also control what we think. When you wake up and you're sad, you're going to think this is going to be an awful day. I can't handle anything. People are going to be mean to me. Nobody likes me. If you keep thinking those things, the worse you feel, and the worse you feel, the more you're going to think about it. So change what you think. Say, well, what's one reason today might be a good day? What's one thing I can do today? And then you change your behavior too. So if we change how we think and we change how we behave, we change how we feel. All seems like common sense stuff when you really think about it, but literally nobody teaches us this when we're kids. And I don't know why they don't, because it would have changed so many lives. And that's what I get from people is, if only I would have learned this 20 years ago.
Oh yeah, listen. At the end of the day, common sense isn't common, and this when you say it, it's like, well, yeah. If I'm pissed off, I should focus on things that are positive, so I don't act when I'm like, again, the more emotion, the less logic. The more anger, the dumber you are. So maybe don't answer that email. Maybe don't respond back to your girlfriend, boyfriend, wife, husband. When you're super pissed off and had a bad day, it seems to make sense. It does make sense, but nobody does it. That's the issue. Like, people don't operate this way, and they respond when they're angry, and they just do things without thinking. And then this, snowballs the problem. And then this is why we're trying to create like a framework where people can step back. And again, there's always going to be problems in life, but how you address that problem is going to yield like wildly different outcomes than if you were just super emotional when you address it. I'm curious, why do you focus on don'ts rather than do's? Like, that's sort of like the premise of your work.
Yeah. So, as a therapist, they told me, build on people's strengths. So when somebody comes into your office and they're like, Amy, I've been writing in my gratitude journal 3 times a day. I'm supposed to be like, yes, you keep that up. And I was doing that, but I thought, like, if I went to a physical trainer and they were like, hey, I want you to work out for 30 minutes, I'd be like, okay, I'll do it. If I really wanted to get in shape, I'll do whatever you tell me to do. But like, what if they didn't tell me to not eat the jelly donut on the way to the gym? Like, I'd be so mad because I'm like, oh, I got to spend an extra hour on the treadmill? No, I'd just rather give up the donut. And that's what I was seeing with people in my office. A lot of these people are incredibly intelligent people. They've read self-help books. They've worked on themselves. Some of them have been in therapy before, and they're doing all of these things. But then they had like one counterproductive bad habit that was just really undoing a lot of their progress, and they felt like they were stuck. And so rather than saying, hey, I want you to go to 3 more yoga classes and meditate for 4 more hours this week, like, well, what if we take that like 30 minutes you spend complaining every week when you come home from work? What if we got rid of that? And instead you just did something different during that time? You could even sit on the couch and watch TV for 30 minutes, but let's not spend 30 minutes complaining about your life. People would be like, oh, my life has changed by giving up something. And sometimes it's tougher than that. It's not just a little habit that we're doing. Sometimes it's something that's deeply ingrained in us, or it's something that we're getting something out of. if we went back to feeling sorry for yourself. I worked with a lot of people who said, I call my friends at night and tell them about all the bad things that happened that day. And then they tell me all the bad things that happened to them. And that's kind of how we bond. So if we're not going to complain about how awful our lives are, what are we going to talk about? And we have to figure that out. Like, okay, what is it that you get out of this habit? And then what could you do instead so that we're still getting that need met? Or somebody who even has a habit like smoking. Well, people know smoking's not good for you, but what do you get out of it? Well, I feel like it relieves my stress. Okay, so then what else are we going to do to relieve your stress? You can't just say, quit smoking to somebody. So we have to look at, like, what do you get out of these things? And then what could you do instead? But when people give up like that one habit that's been keeping them stuck in life, suddenly all of their good habits become so much more effective. And I'm a huge fan of saying, let's work smarter instead of harder. So many people would come into my office and they were exhausted. And even coming to therapy just felt like one more chore on their list. And the last thing they wanted was for me to tell them, here's 6 more things you have to do this week. And I know that when I felt like I was in a rough place in life, that wouldn't have been helpful either. I just needed to know, like, what do you not need to do today? And if I read that list in the morning, which I would read it in the morning, read it in the afternoon, read it in the evening. As long as I could say, don't do these things today and you'll be okay, that felt much more manageable than if I'd created a list of 13 things I felt like I had to do today.
I just want to take a quick break and thank the HubSpot Podcast Network for supporting Success Story for the past few years. Now, the HubSpot Podcast Network has other incredible podcasts like My First Million. Now, if you are an entrepreneur or you are ready to turn your entrepreneurial dreams into millions, you have to listen to My First Million. It's a show that is revolutionizing business podcasting. It's hosted by Sam Parr, Sean Purry. This is a HubSpot Podcast Network original. It brings you unfiltered conversations with self-made millionaires who actually tell you how they did it. If you want to learn how Alex Hormozi built his fitness empire, or how Sophia Amoruso turned Nasty Girl into a fashion phenomenon, these aren't just success stories, they're the blueprints for your own journey to the top. Each episode breaks down the exact strategies and hidden opportunities that you can use right now. Don't just dream about your first million, learn how to make it. Listen to My First Million wherever you get your podcasts. I think it's very wise, and you've probably seen it. I'm so curious, but you believe that there are some habits that are there's some negative habits that people do that are so powerful that it can derail all of the positive progress they're making. Like that's how bad some of these like bad habits can be that maybe don't even seem that bad. Like complaining for 30 minutes after work doesn't seem that bad, but you're saying that can derail so much progress.
It really can. And that's the thing. A lot of these things don't feel like they're a huge deal. Or if somebody says, all right, I struggle with taking risks. Well, this person might be making incredible progress in their professional life and in their personal life. And yet certain roadblocks are going to keep them from ever making enough progress so they feel like they're really able to reach their greatest potential. So somebody might be like, yeah, I have some friends, but like I never take the first step. I never invite somebody for coffee unless I'm certain that they really want to be friends with me, this new acquaintance that I met somewhere. Or I never want to take a business risk because what if it didn't work out? So that's somebody who, no matter how much meditating they do or how many times they write in their gratitude journal, if you don't dare take a risk because you can't handle anxiety, it doesn't matter that you're doing all these other things.
How does somebody go about sort of assessing where they are on their own mental strength?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because I've had people read the book and they'll say, I didn't really think I was a people pleaser. And until I read the chapter, and then it really resonated with me. So every chapter has like a checklist that you can go through to say, do I do any of these things? And sometimes that helps people recognize it. But I think just in our own lives, we can ask ourselves, like, what's the emotion that I'm really uncomfortable feeling? And I think we all have one. It might be embarrassment, so we don't take social risks. Or it might be anxiety, so we don't do anything that would really put us out there and help us try new things. It might be sadness, so we don't ever want to do anything where we might fail because I'd be too sad and I couldn't handle that. So just by asking yourself that question, you can get some good insight into like, what's that emotion that I'm terrified to experience? And then when I do experience it, what do I do? So sometimes somebody will be like, well, I just push it away and try not to feel it. Or I'm really quick to, and we all have smartphones these days. So somebody who is intolerant of boredom picks up their phone all the time. Or loneliness. Somebody's, I can't tolerate feeling lonely. So we pick up our phones. And our phones can be incredible ways to build mental strength because you have all this free advice and all these cool tools and apps and things you can do now. But for a lot of us, it just becomes a way to avoid feeling uncomfortable. And if you don't ever feel an uncomfortable emotion, you struggle to learn from it.
Is there, when people sort of dive into the self-help realm of mental strength, they're going to come across other concepts like resilience and grit and all these other things. And is there a significant difference? Because I don't want people to get confused between one or the other, or maybe they are the same. I have no idea. But from, I mean, at least your interpretation, are there some differences between all of these sort of mindset topics that people are going to try and incorporate?
Yeah, I love that you asked that because a lot of people use a lot of these words interchangeably. But we talk about resilience, it's about bouncing back from something hard in your life. I don't think we should live our whole lives like building something just so we can wait for the next shoe to drop, right? Like,
Yes.
we're all going to experience hardship, but goodness, I want us to enjoy the good times in life too. And mental strength is really about that, about how do I enjoy the good times in life and get the fullest out of it. Because a lot of people struggle with that. They'll say, I can't let myself be happy, or I struggle with allowing myself to feel certain feelings. So mental strength will do that. Yes, it will help you bounce back from hardships, but I guarantee it makes the good times a million times better too. So it's about both. And when it comes to grit, people talk about grit and perseverance. Sometimes people use those interchangeably, but it's really about your ability to keep going. Well, I don't think we should. I think we keep going, most of us, far too long. I think we should quit more often and quit faster. I see so many people who are like, I had a sprained ankle, but I kept running because I thought that was like the epitome of toughness and perseverance. Like, well, now you can't run for 6 months because you've really messed it up. If you'd just taken a break that day, you'd be in much better shape. Or, my business was losing money for 3 months, but I was like, if I just tough it out a little longer, then
3 months? How about like 3 years? Like,
right. I don't encounter people who are like, I'm not going to give up. And I'm like, no, please give up, change course, do something different. And so mental strength is about that too, about knowing that it's okay to ask for help. It's okay to completely quit, do something different, and to have the strength to say, my ego doesn't depend on that. I don't have to finish the race on a broken leg, or I don't have to make this business come to fruition just because I declared 3 years ago I was going to do it. Maybe that's not my goal anymore. Maybe it doesn't make sense, or maybe it just isn't going to work out, and that's okay. So I think what really differentiates mental strength, it's not like I'm going to win at all costs. It's like, no, I'm going to be okay even if I don't win. Either way is fine, and I'll do my best, but that's okay regardless of how it turns out.
that is a key differentiation. And I think that's a much healthier way to go through life. Because again, when you put it out, I completely agree that that is how those words can be interpreted. And I actually don't even think that's the way that, I mean, Angela Duckworth is grit. I don't think there's anybody that really champions the words perseverance or resilience, but I don't think anybody who's built anything meaningful wants you to go through and keep going when things aren't working out. You have to have a signal for when it's moving in the right direction, but slowly, versus when it's not moving in the right direction at all. Or even when your North Star as a human starts to change, and you have to understand that, and that has to guide your decisions. So I love this. So it's not about like win at all costs. It's about, is this a thing you even want to win at? Maybe not. And that's where the mental toughness and the mental strength comes into, to have that hard conversation with yourself so that you can make the right decision.
Absolutely. Because how many times do we start something and then you're like, I didn't realize it was going to take up this much of my life. Like if
It's hurting your relationships. It's hurting your, you're about to divorce your wife because you're working so much. This is not the best way to live life. There's other things that are important.
Exactly. And so many of us want to like stick it out because they think, no, I signed up for this. I'm going to do it. Or we think that like we're suffering for a purpose. Like I'm going to work 80 hours a week until I'm like, what for? If you decide that this takes up and your goals have changed and it's not in line with your values, do something different. That's okay.
So mental strength, there has to be a component of it that is tied into almost emotional intelligence. Because you have to be understanding, you have to understand what direction you are actually going in and why you're going in that direction, and not just, again, winning at all costs. So does mental strength require emotional intelligence, or do you have to improve your emotional intelligence? to improve your mental strength. Is there some correlation between the two concepts?
There is. So I hear emotional intelligence. People have kind of changed the definition over the years, as what happens with a lot of things. And so I hear people say, like, you really need to understand how the person you're talking to feels. But if I were to ask you to list as many feeling words as you could, like, you might struggle to come up with a 10-page paper on vocabulary words for emotions. And I'll do this with executives. When I do a speaking engagement, I'll say, I want you to take out a piece of paper and a pen, write down as many feeling words as you can in 30 seconds. And for like 5 seconds, these people are like smoke coming up from the paper because they're writing down sad, mad. And then you get to about 5 words on average. And then we start to struggle with even like naming an emotion. And so for a lot of people, we're not even able to recognize our own emotions, let alone guess what somebody else is feeling. So when I ask you, like, how do you feel today? Okay, good, all right. The people, and we don't use words in our everyday conversation. You might say, I have butterflies in my stomach. Nobody walks around and says, actually, I'm feeling a little anxious right now. And so we don't spend enough time focusing on, like, how do I feel? And then when we guess how other people feel, we're not very good at it, according to what the research says. And yet we're not willing to ask either. Like, nobody says, like, are you sure that's how you feel today? Or you look a little anxious. What's going on? Like, it's pretty rare that people have these discussions. So I do think part of mental strength is more about self-awareness and then asking, like, and then how might you be feeling? To ask the question and don't pretend to be a mind reader. Because when I hear people talk about emotional intelligence, sometimes they're talking about like this psychological trickery of, if I walk into a negotiation and I ask you a question and you answer it in the affirmative, then I'm 2 steps ahead of you. And they're like trying to do all of this stuff where instead of just figuring out, like, how do I feel? Like, we know from the research, if I'm going to ask for a raise, the last time I should do that is when I feel sad. Because if I say, hey, I'd like $10 more an hour, and you say, I'm going to give you 5, I won't counter back at 750 because I'm like, my ego can't handle one more blow to it today. So I'll take a bad deal. So I think if we just focused more on our own emotions and being aware of how I feel when I walk into a situation, it would make things so much better than trying to then play a game of chess where not only do I need to know how I feel, I'm going to guess how you feel, and then I'm going to make a move based on how I think you're feeling. Because 99% of the time, I think we get it wrong. If we were to say to somebody, how did the other person feel? And we also lack self-awareness too. There's a lot of research on this that frightens me. So one of my favorite studies, they had these 2 people negotiating. They put people in pairs. They have them negotiate over kind of like worthless objects or whatever. And at the end of the experiment, they ask people, were you a jerk or were you a pushover? And then they asked the other person who was on the other end of it, was this person a jerk or was this person a pushover? Almost everybody got it wrong compared to how the other person was. The people that are like, I was a pushover. The other person's like, no, actually, you were a jerk. So the fact that we can't even tell when we're negotiating whether we're kind of wimpy or whether we're over the top, I think speaks volumes. And sometimes people will say, well, what other people think of you is none of your business. No, it absolutely is your business. Do you know how many people come into my therapy office and they're like, I have no idea why I got fired from the last 3 jobs. I'm a really polite person. I'm a hard worker. Well, that's not how other people see you. So you need to know how you're being perceived. Or people that have relationship problems don't know that they're coming across maybe as rude or that they're coming across as insincere. So rather than guessing how other people feel, this is a long answer to your question about emotional intelligence, but rather than guess how other people feel, I think we do a lot better if we just focused on how do I feel and to be more open to asking people, like, how do I come across in a meeting when I speak up? Do it look like I'm assertive or does it look like I'm wildly angry and have no idea what I'm talking about or I can't control my emotions? That would serve us much better.
But I think that's so smart because then when you actually have a good barometer, a good reading of who you are, then that's where you can apply mental strength appropriately. Because if somebody thinks if you don't know how you come across, again, a lot of people listen to this podcast are like entrepreneur, business, all of that. But I mean, everybody who's listening, who's trying to figure out how to deal with their job or their business partner or their employee they just hired, they also have a spouse at home and they're trying to figure out how they come across to their spouse. And sometimes I think that, sometimes it's people have a very hard, the A-type personalities that are entrepreneurial, I think sometimes have a very hard time. It could be effective to a degree in the workplace, but then you bring that shit home And that's also going to be pretty difficult for your spouse, especially if when you first got together, you weren't that person. And then you felt like you had to become that person to be successful. And that's a whole other conversation, because I don't think you have to change your personality to be successful. I think that's something that almost like a trap people fall into. But say you started a company, now you have hundreds of employees and you feel like you have to be different. And then you bring that shit home. Well, it's because you've lost sense of who you are. And then if your spouse argues with you, well, you don't apply mental strength and find the will to argue back. You got to do some introspection and realize, like, it's not them that's the issue, it's me. And the mental strength application is actually like getting my shit together and being a good partner, not coming to the argument with as much fire and ammo as possible. So I think that self-awareness piece, because you don't want to incorrectly apply mental strength either.
You're right. There's a whole bunch of tools and skills, and we need to know part of mental strength is knowing when to pull out each tool, right? Spouse says, hey, I could use some help with the dishes. Like, you really aren't going to negotiate. I'll do 3 dishes if you do 4. Like, not the time to be using that, or I'm going to calm myself down before I answer your question. Like, there's all of these tools and strategies, and part of self-awareness is knowing, like, yeah, when do I use that? And it works well in this situation in my professional life, but maybe not in my personal life.
Are there any strategies, or because when we first started chatting, there's these life events that sort of come out of nowhere and they totally throw you off, and then if you haven't been like practicing or finding some way to increase your mental strength when these things don't happen to you, then when things do happen to you, you kind of feel like your emotion gets high, you make bad decisions. Are there like daily practices or daily things that you can do when there's nothing bad happening that can increase your mental strength so that when shit does happen, you're better equipped to deal with it?
Yeah, and the last time you want to like work on your physical muscles is like you have to lift up a heavy box, or like, let me go lift some weights right now and I'm going to pick that box up. Like, you wanted to do that last month. So I think it's always a good idea to be working on our mental strength, no matter how strong you think you are. And I know I've been saying things like, you don't need to do all of these gratitude or meditation practices, but those are actually the practices that you do want to be doing. You just don't want to have the bad habits that outweigh them. So one thing we can always be working on is the thoughts that run through our head. You have something like 60,000 thoughts a day. The vast majority of them are repetitive with what you thought yesterday, and a lot of them aren't true. And you have certain thoughts about yourself, of what you're capable of, what you can't do. So sometimes just learning to ask yourself, like, how true is this thought? Is it a fact or an opinion? If you're thinking, oh, I'm not good at negotiating, is that a fact or an opinion? Is it something you could work on? And just asking yourself occasionally, like, what would I say to my friend who had this problem? You messed up at work and you come home and you think, oh, I embarrassed myself today. I've ruined everything. What would I say if my friend called me and said that? Like, no, you'd probably be like, you'll do better next time, or it's not as bad as you think. We're not going to be like, well, stupid, you ruined everything. But yeah, we often think those things to ourselves. So learning to practice a little more self-compassion and a little more realistic thinking goes a long way. And then just getting more aware of how we feel. And so it might be a matter of printing off a list of feeling words. Just Google emotional vocabulary words, print it out. You hang it on your bathroom mirror. So you're brushing your teeth hopefully twice a day, in the morning and again at night. Just look at the list and say, how do I feel right now? And get a little more used to putting a name to whatever that emotion is. And then thinking, like, how did this emotion affect me today? Maybe you're anxious about your grandmother's health test, and all of a sudden tomorrow you have a huge meeting. Well, you're likely to carry that anxiety into that meeting, but just being aware, okay, I feel anxious today, so probably going to be kind of risk adverse walking into this meeting. That self-awareness goes a long way, so that if in 3 months or 6 months you run into a much bigger hardship or an incredible difficulty, you already have some skills in your tool belt of how to change your thinking and how to cope and identify with some of those emotions that you're having.
Is there a model, like, does this model work if, even again at the beginning, you're saying as a kid you didn't have anything? Is there a model that parents can teach over to their kids to start building that mental strength at a young age? Does this model work for them as well? Is there something else that they could do?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So that was the biggest question I got when my first book came out, was parents saying, great, how do we teach this to kids? I want my 12-year-old to learn this. So I wrote a book called 13 Things Mentally Strong Parents Don't Do. And it's really about how do we start teaching these skills to kids when they're 4 or 5 and up to the teenage years. And part of it is like for us not to take responsibility for their emotions. In today's world, when kids are bored, we entertain them. When they're sad, we cheer them up. When they're angry, we want to calm them down. So instead of us doing it, like, how do you give them the tools? And there's lots of things we can do right in the moment. A toolkit for little kids, for example. You might have a physical toolkit of, here's your calm down kit. When you're angry, go get something out of that box, that Play-Doh or something that helps to calm you down. And I wrote a book for kids too. It's for the 8 to 12-year-old range, for older kids to have the language, the vocabulary, so that they're starting to learn, okay, here's what you do when things are tough and how to get through it. Because I think it's so important that we start learning these things when we're younger.
I don't fully agree. I mean, like, everybody listening to this show is pretty much set on personal development. So they buy into these concepts already, but these concepts don't exist in silos, right? You have kids, you have partners. Actually, that's an interesting point too. Somebody listening to this, their partner isn't, or even their coworker isn't. Somebody in their universe is not listening to this show, and they want to support that person going through a tough time. Is there a strategy to help somebody else go through something as well?
There is. So our tendency is to often give people advice, right? So if you come to me with a problem, I'm going to be tempted to be really quick to be like, I know what you should do. But what happens is, let's say you started smoking cigarettes. Tomorrow you decided smoking was going to be an amazing thing that was going to help you with your stress. So then the next day I say, actually, smoking's bad for you. You should quit. You then start to tell me all the reasons why you enjoy smoking. Well, actually, Amy, it helps me with my stress. Makes me feel a lot better. I get to take a break every 20 minutes to go smoke a cigarette, and I love that. So what I've done by telling you not to smoke is I've actually increased the chances that you're going to keep smoking. When we lecture somebody or we give them advice, they actually then reply with all the reasons why they don't want to do something. And we tend to believe the words coming out of our own mouths much more than we believe somebody else's words. So when I say to you, no, I love this bad habit and here's why, it actually ingrains it deeper in my brain. So what you want to do when you're helping somebody else build mental strength, or they're going through a tough time, is just be a good listener and ask questions. Like, hey, do you have any concerns about smoking? But not in like a smug kind of a way, but to ask that, and maybe they'll say, I actually think it costs a lot of money. Oh, okay. They may not have the concern that it's bad for their lungs, but they might say, I'm concerned about the financial factor. So then you go with that, like, oh, really? How much does it cost to smoke these days? And then you tell me about that. And then it's going to increase the chances that you might create some change in your life. So I think just by asking questions and by letting people know whatever they feel is okay. Somebody's going through a tough time and they're really sad. Sometimes we're like, hey, you want to go bowling? Because we think we should make you happy for the day. So like, I'm going to drag you out of the house. We're going to go to dinner and I'm going to cheer you up. And then I feel really good about myself when I go home because I made you happy today. But sometimes people just need to feel sad, and they need somebody close enough to them who can tolerate their sadness. So instead of like, no, everything's going to be okay, you can say, gosh, I know things feel really dark right now. When you can say that to somebody, they feel like much more understood and heard. And usually that's what people need when they're in a dark place. People tend to figure out their problems on their own. And they especially can get there when they have somebody they can bounce that idea off of. And if they ask you for your advice, by all means, be willing to say, if I was in your situation, I think this is what I might do. But to be slower with giving people advice on, you just got to get up and get outside, or if you start doing the X, Y, and Z, you'll feel a lot better, because that doesn't work.
I want to take a second and thank Range Rover Sport for supporting today's episode. Now, let's talk about tools that match your ambition, that match the ambition of everybody who's listening today, who has taken risks, who has up-leveled their personal, professional development, who has tried to build their own thing. Everybody listening gets it. There is a moment when the thing you're trying to build, the challenge that you're taking on, it finally starts to take off. There's like this rush of excitement and possibility, and that feeling that you get when you get behind of the wheel of a Range Rover Sport, because we've all had that perfect drive when the road, the car, and you're all in perfect harmony. But that's not just by chance. The Range Rover Sport is designed to make every drive feel that way. And the Range Rover Sport is not just for impressing others. It's how you feel behind the wheel. It's how you feel when things are going the way they're supposed to go. Whether or not you're navigating city streets, you're exploring back roads, the Range Rover Sport combines refinement with a sense of adventure. It matches your own versatile lifestyle. With features like adaptive off-road cruise control, you can tackle challenging terrain with confidence. The dynamic air suspension always makes sure you get a smooth ride It responds to road conditions for optimal performance. So from daily commutes to weekend getaways, the Range Rover Sport is ready for whatever you have planned. It's more than just a vehicle. It is a companion for all of your journey. So if you're ready to elevate your driving experience, visit LandRoverUSA.com and configure your Range Rover Sport today.
Yeah, I think another thing that people probably, if someone's listening to this, they're probably trying to figure out, okay, when should I, even in my own life, like when should I apply mental strength versus when is there a situation that is so overwhelming that I actually should go and seek out like professional help? And I don't want to leave people just thinking that you're going to be perfectly fine tomorrow if you start practicing these things, because that's not realistic. Obviously, it takes a while to build up this muscle. So do you have advice, or if somebody's listening to this, they're trying to find a signal that, okay, this practice that I'm trying to incorporate is not enough to deal with the amount of trauma and grief and stress that I'm dealing with. I should probably go speak to somebody because these internal mechanisms are not working 100%. What's that point where you feel like somebody, the mental strength isn't cutting it? They should go talk to somebody.
If it's interfering with your functioning for more than 2 weeks, so if you have trouble sleeping because you're so worried about something, or your appetite has significantly changed because you're sad or anxious or you've been through something, if it's interfering with your ability to concentrate at work, if you're just stressed out in general, and you're like, I'm not feeling good. Headaches and stomach aches tend to be really common issues that are actually much more likely to be related to mental health as compared to physical health. Statistically, the vast majority of emergency room visits are actually mental health related. People have panic attacks and they think they're having a heart attack. A lot of the ER visits are more about anxiety. And doctors will say, well, you should do something about that, but they often don't set people up with a therapist because they're the ER doctor. They're just making sure you're not going to die in that minute, and they send you home. So I always say, if you are struggling with something for more than 2 weeks, by all means, reach out to somebody. But even if you aren't, and you're just kind of like, I'd like a checkup to know how I'm doing, reach out to a therapist. It used to be the old model was you had to have a mental illness and you had to sign up for therapy once you were already depressed. Fortunately, that's changing. So if you just say, I just want to know, like, what areas could I be doing better? Or what kind of struggles might I have that I could work on? Or what issues do I want to address? You can call somebody and say, I'm not sure I need therapy, but can I just kind of come in and run some things past you? And sometimes that's just reassuring. Oh, okay, you're on the right page, or this is normal given your circumstances, or here's what to be out on the lookout for. If things started to change and you saw these things, then you would know it was a sign that perhaps you need to talk to somebody. And we can do that too. If you have a partner, a child, somebody else in your life who won't get help, is for you to go to therapy, talk to a therapist and say, this is what's going on. What else can I do to support the person? And sometimes that makes a world of difference too.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. Is there, are there some commonly held beliefs about mental strength which you don't agree with? Things that people may assume is true, but you feel like it's inaccurate or they're doing more harm than good?
The big one is that people will say, like, I wish I could be mentally strong, but I have depression or have anxiety. And that's not true at all. Just like it makes more sense when we think about it in terms of physical strength. Like you can go to the gym and you can work out and become physically strong. And it usually prevents health problems, but you might still get high cholesterol, high blood pressure through no fault of your own, your genetics, your life experiences. Mental health and mental strength is the same. Building mental strength improves your mental health. But if you develop something like anxiety or depression, it doesn't mean that you're a weak person. It just means this is something that you're struggling with. And some of the strongest people I've ever met were battling some kind of a mental health issue, yet they're still showing up every day. So to know that it's about the habits you have every day, the choices you make, there's so many things you can do to build mental strength. But if you develop a mental health issue, by all means, reach out and ask for help.
I love that analogy too, because a lot of these, I mean, I don't know if mental health there's some predisposed things that you can inherit from your parents. I have no idea, but I know that in physical health, I mean, I'll give you a personal example. So my grandpa, he's passed away now. He had Alzheimer's, dementia, and that's like in the family. So I'm trying to do my best to do things that are going to push that back as far as possible. And thank God he lived to, late 90s. So that's a great life. But
still, I could do all the right things. I could work out 7 days a week, and I know that's still in my family. So this is just a great conversation about it's not your fault if some of these things are still happening to you, not physical but mental as well, because you can't control what you're predisposed to. You can't control a lot of things that you could do all the right things and you still end up in a less than ideal situation.
Absolutely. And I see so many people too who, when they go through something traumatic, that they feel like they have to pop right back up and be like, I'm good, I'm good. Even though they're struggling, because they feel like that's a sign of mental strength too. Like, I went through 7 traumatic things and I'm completely unscathed. And so many people will say things like, well, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. But like, I don't think that's true either. I think sometimes when you go through really tough times, you can come out scarred, and you don't necessarily always come out better and happier or anything like that. And so we shouldn't minimize our life experiences. If something happened to you when you were a kid or something bad happens to you as an adult, you don't have to feel like you're going to come out and emerge stronger, especially the next day. But I see a lot of people who I think feel that pressure to say, nope, that didn't bother me at all. But really, they haven't even dealt with it at all.
Is there an appropriate way to not only deal with traumas, but also potentially use them to increase mental strength in the future? Like, if something happens to you, what's the best reaction that will actually help you not benefit? Benefit is a completely incorrect word, but use the situation so that even in 10 years from now, that could be a useful learning or addition to your mental strength.
Yeah, in the days after something, we know that the most important thing you could do is, whether you just went through a horrific car accident or a natural disaster, whatever feelings you feel are okay. Let yourself feel those, whether you're angry, anxious, sad, and to get social support. Social support is like one of the number one factors of, if you have somebody that you can talk to and who can relate to you, you're much more likely to feel like you're able to get through it. And a lot of what we know about getting through tough times is our ability to then realize that we have inner strength, resources, things that help us to get through it. And when we're in a rough spot, sometimes we need somebody else to point out to us and remind us of, like, you'll get through this. And just hearing it from somebody else can be good. And then down the road, when people do go through traumatic experiences and they feel like somehow it changed them, maybe in a way that's for the better, it's often because they can say, I learned from it. Like, I wished it hadn't happened, yet I learned something incredible about myself, or it changed something. I know for me, public speaking was my biggest fear in life. So not only did I not speak like in school, but even in college, like, never raised my hand, never said a word. I gave the eulogy at my husband's funeral. And let me tell you, these days, public speaking is not scary at all. Like, if I can give a eulogy at somebody's funeral, like getting up in front of a crowd of corporate professionals is really not so scary anymore. So if I had to say, did anything good come out of it? Well, it wasn't a great experience, but at the same time, I certainly learned a lot, and I don't sweat the small stuff anymore. And I no longer have to worry about vomiting before I go to school every day. So in a strange way, yeah, there are some things that came out of it that I think I wouldn't have been able to experience if I hadn't gone through those things.
Yeah, I think it's just about, I think that you made a really, really good point. So if you go through something traumatic, you don't have to bounce back and learn from it tomorrow.
Right.
But there can be things in the future that will evolve you as a human, for sure. But I think the issue is when somebody tries to shut those emotions down the second they happen, because they feel like that's the way they have to be tough for everyone else. Whatever the reason is, they have to be tough for themselves, be tough for everyone else. I think that's when, again, I'm not a professional, but to me that makes the most sense as to why trauma sort of implants itself that can honestly impact you 10, 20, 30 years in the future. It's because you try and push stuff down and deal with it too quickly. That seems to be a very bad idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's tempting as it is to be like, no, I'm good, right after something happens, that you don't want to do that.
Okay, so you have 13 don'ts. You wrote the article, you did the TED Talk, you've put the book together, but it's been a minute. Would there be a 14th? Anything that you'd want to add to the book since, or the article since, that you feel like has sort of come into your life that would be a great 14th point?
Oh, great question. I don't think so. Like, I've never just come up with like one thing of like, oh, I wished I would have added that to the book or anything like that, which is interesting because I wrote the book based on the article, and the article was something I wrote to myself, but I'd certainly been thinking about it for years, even though I had never put pen to paper. So I don't think so. The joy of I have 6 books, so I've been able to write about so many things in all the subsequent books, but I've never come up with like one thing that I feel like I was missing in that book.
Good. It's a complete list. That's all that matters. I was just curious if you've seen something or noticed something in yourself that you didn't include, really. But that's good. It's very, very good. Um, let what would be, because mental health, mental strength. I'll say the same thing but different. Let me explain where I'm going with this. So mental health, mental strength, obviously, very much in vogue topics right now. When you are looking at new problems that people are dealing with, or you're even researching new things that are affecting some of your patients, what are some new things that you're looking at, or new ideas, or new concepts, or new treatments, or even just new stressors, even in a post-COVID world, that people are dealing with right now that you think would be highly relevant, that you sort of see coming up time and time again?
Ooh, I think, I guess if anything good came out of COVID, it's that people are talking more about mental health. And I think people have realized that subtract something from your life and suddenly we're all only one step away from having something like depression or anxiety anyway. So it's become much more common in conversation. But on the flip side, one of the bad things I'm seeing is it's almost watered it down to the point that people who are really struggling are feeling almost dismissed. Well, they'll say, well, everybody has anxiety, right? Yes, we all have the emotion of anxiety, but not everybody has an anxiety disorder. Or I see people who are really quick to say, well, I have social anxiety too. Person doesn't have social anxiety. They just maybe are a little more introverted than other people. So I see a lot of these words misused, like everybody's a narcissist these days or a sociopath. And I see a lot of these things getting used as a weapon almost, where people are throwing them into conversations and using them as if they're just everyday things, and people diagnosing themselves with things that they don't necessarily have. So that's one of my big concerns. And I guess the other huge concern I'm hearing from people is how people are feeling burned out these days, just from feeling like they can't shut off work, that they started working from home perhaps during the pandemic, or in a post-pandemic world, they feel like they have to get ahead, and then they feel like they're on this treadmill and they can never get off because they have to stay up late tonight to get more work done for tomorrow. And then tomorrow they still don't feel like they're ahead, and they feel like they're falling further and further behind every day, and they don't know how to get off. And of course, in today's economy where people are stressed out because of money anyway, and then people say, well, I have to keep stepping it up and I don't know what else to do and I don't have time for anything. And in the meantime, they feel like their mental health is perhaps suffering, but then don't know what to do about it. And so I do have a lot of concerns about burnout and people feeling like they need to be more productive, yet can't be productive enough right now.
Well, I think that ties back into that. Do you even want to win the game that you're playing? And I think burnout comes from that. I think burnout comes from people over-indexing on resilience and do it at all costs and never give up, and not enough on having the mental strength and the self-awareness and the EQ to understand, is this a direction that I actually want to be moving in? And I mean, there's a lot of reasons as to why this is, but I mean, whether or not it's hustle culture or COVID or cost of living increasing, like it's like this perfect storm of all this BS that's causing this stress. And for that person who does feel like they're on this hamster wheel, just bring it back to mental strength. What would be the advice so that they can at least for a second pause, take their foot off that treadmill, and then understand the actions they can take to start to move in the right direction? Even if it's not tactical at first and it's only psychological, because that would be the first step.
Yeah. So sometimes about knowing like, what are my values in life and am I living according to my values? It's so easy to get off course where we say, I value family, yet I'm working 120 hours a week. So is that really the kind of life I want to live? And we have to take a step back, because otherwise life happens to us and we get involved in all of these things without saying like, what actually do I value? And does my life reflect that? And a good way to do that is to get some psychological distance, where maybe you do that test where you pretend that you're 100 years old and you're looking back over your life and you just say, like, what would make me say, gosh, that was a life well lived? And maybe it is having $5 million in the bank, but maybe not. Maybe you think, gee, like, nobody's going to put on my tombstone. She sure was productive. Like, so then what do I want people to say? Like, I was a nice person. I did some kind things. I spent a lot of time with friends and family. Maybe I didn't have the nice house and the nice car, but I did these other things instead. So to really get in tune with what are your values and are you living according to them? And to make sure that our lives reflect that. Sometimes when I work with parents and I work with kids, I'll do a speaking engagement during the day where I speak to the kids and I'll ask them, if your parents were to come into a parent-teacher conference tomorrow, what would they most likely want to hear the teacher say? That you're the smartest kid in the class or that you're the kindest kid? And like 99.9% of the kids are like, oh, my mom wants me to be the smartest kid in the class. And then that night I'll ask the parents, what would you rather hear? And whether it's just because parents think this is socially appropriate, but a lot of the parents are like, no, I want my kid to be kind. So then we'll go home tonight and ask your child what they think it is. And then I want you to think, like, well, how often do we talk about kindness at home versus how much do I say, did you do your homework today? And just think about those little things in our lives. And even if you don't have kids, like, what's really reflected in your life with where you spend your time, where your money goes, your calendar and your checkbook are quite reflective of a lot of things in your life. And does that really reflect how you'd want to be spending your time so that when you're 100 years old and you look back and think, my 30s, 40s, whatever decade you're in was really time well spent.
Very good advice. Okay. Where can people go connect with you, get more of your content? I mean, your book's going to be on Amazon. I'll put in the show notes as well. But just some links, drop some links so people know where to go.
Sure. My website is Amy Morin, LCSW, as in licensed clinical social worker.com. And on there, you can find info on all 6 of my books, as well as I have a podcast called The Mentally Stronger Podcast with therapist Amy Morin. And we discuss strategies for building mental strength twice a week. I have a guest on Mondays and I do a solo episode on Fridays and talk about all things related to becoming mentally stronger.
Amazing. Okay. Last question I love to ask, because you've had a great career, multiple seasons to your life and your career. And if you could look back and tell your 20-year-old self one thing, and it could be about your work, it can be about mental strength, it could be about anything. If you have to go back and tell your 20-year-old self one thing, what would that thing be?
Oh, I would say enjoy the ride. It's going to be an incredible adventure with lots of ups and downs, but just enjoy the ride and don't worry too much about what's going to happen in the future.